Um, Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our book talk today. I'm Sami Tayyab, the Director of Middle East Books and More. Today, we'll be talking with Manal Jamal about her latest book, Promoting Democracy, The Force of Political Settlements in Uncertain Times, which you can purchase from our bookstore at the link below the video here. Also, after our initial discussion, we'll try to get some viewer responses and questions, which you can type in the chat box to the right of the video. So with no further ado, I'll give a short introduction for Manal here. She is a professor of political science at James Madison University. She has held research fellowship positions at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and at UC Berkeley's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Manal, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me here. Back in March when we talked about the possibility of having this talk, I was certain, or not certain, but I thought that by August things would look different and this would be an in-person event. But alas, here we are. But I'm happy to be here and thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, absolutely. So much has transpired since March. So I'm really happy we can do this today too. In your recent book, you look at how Western-funded democracy promotion efforts, and you explain why they are successful in some cases, and while in other cases they have failed. So could you tell us what your main findings were, and what was the key determining factor on whether a program was successful or not?
Okay, very importantly, just as background, I wasn't looking at specific programs. I was interested in the outcome at a macro level, and I'm interested if there were factors shaping why in some cases programs are more likely to be successful than in other cases. In where I wanted to make my contribution, what I was engaging wasn't the Palestine studies literature or the Middle East studies literature, but I wanted to make a theoretical contribution to the broader literature on democracy promotion and civil society. And what my findings showed is that it is critical that the analysis has to be taken a step back, and that before even beginning to examine, the donor projects and programs, we needed to understand very carefully and very intimately the political context in which this aid is operating. So that was one of the things that became very apparent to me early on in the research. And I focused on one key dimension that I argue plays a pivotal role in determining the impact of this aid, and that is the political settlements that are operating in a given society. And I look at one dimension, and that is the inclusivity of a political settlement. Okay? By political settlement, I'm referring to the informal and formal political agreements in a society. And these agreements basically determine who's included, who is not included. They determine key players. They determine, the rules of the game. And my key finding, or what I argue and illustrate throughout this book, is that in contexts where you have a non-inclusive political settlement and key political groups are excluded, democracy aid, no matter what, is bound to fail. Democracy will not take root, and democracy aid is not going to have a positive impact. And this is what happens in the Palestinian case. We end up with different results in the Salvadorian case that I also examined because the political settlement was more inclusive. So that's it in a nutshell. But very importantly, democracy assistance will not determine outcomes. They will not determine whether there is democracy or not democracy. Donors can't come in and seed democracy in a certain context. Western aid, foreign aid, democracy assistance can exacerbate certain dynamics, shape certain dynamics, but not determine them.
Okay, so it depends on whether a political settlement is inclusive or exclusive for the success of democracy promotion efforts by Western funders.
It's a key factor. It's a key factor that will influence the impact of this assistance. And I think many people overdetermine the impact of this assistance. So they automatically examine it as if it will determine whether there is democracy or not, or whether democracy will take root. And what I'm arguing is in some contexts, such as the Palestinian case, whether there is this kind of democracy promotion assistance or not, democracy was not going to take root.
Okay.
Because of the kind of political settlement we have in place.
Yeah, yeah. So just kind of taking a step back from delving into some of the more in-depth stuff in the book. So what first got you interested in development aid and linking it to democracy promotion efforts? You had a story in the preface of your book that I thought was really interesting.
Yes,
I don't know if you want to start there or not, but
yes,
yeah.
I'll start with just background about how I even started with aid. It was, I actually wrote my master's thesis on, what economic development would look like in the post-Oslo era. And also I was beginning to examine this aid. And then by coincidence, when I moved back to Palestinian territories in the late 90s, I ended up working on a project on donor assistance. I was working as a researcher and a journalist. And the project I was working on at the Jerusalem Media Communication Center was on donor assistance to Palestine. And I was working on the project with Professor Adel Zagha at Birzeit University. The objective of the project was to examine the influx of aid at the time, but also to generate some kind of discussion among members of the donor community, decision makers in the Palestinian Authority, and also policymakers and Palestinian academics who were interested in these topics. So that was our broad objective. So I was been working on these issues for quite a long time. And what became apparent to me very early on as we, looked at the numbers and, determined donor priorities, development priorities on the part of the Palestinian Authority, is despite the ample assistance that was being allocated to Palestine in terms of infrastructural development, in terms of budget support, in terms of democracy promotion, to civil society, the positive outcomes that we anticipated were not there. On the contrary, the majority of Palestinian society remained unaffected or was not impacted by this aid. And on the level of democracy, democracy didn't seem very in terms of democracy taking root, prospects did not seem promising, and civil society was actually weakening. It became more fragmented, more polarized, and these were my initial observations. And the more I studied these issues, I realized there was a lot more I wanted to really formally study in a cross-regional lens, not only looking at Palestine. But then there's one incident that crystallized my interest, and that was the car theft. The theft of my car. I'm not going to go into too much detail in the story because I do want the audience members to purchase the book and to read it. But what happened on one nice spring day is my car was parked on Highway 1 in Jerusalem, and I came back to my car only to realize that it was stolen. And there were two Israeli Jewish men standing there. I'm like, well, my car was here. Where did it go? And they were like, oh, some Palestinian guys drove away with it. I was like, okay. So to make a long story short, I did my research, spoke to people, and it turned out, yes, my car was robbed by some young Palestinian men, but it was also sold to a chop shop that was also owned by Palestinians, but they were committed to a nationalist policy. So, because that's very important to know that there are different chop shops that have different policies. And they agreed that they would sell me the car, give it back to me because I was a case of mistaken identity. But what happened, I'm making a long story short, is I ended up going to this remote village, and I met the people who stole my car, the young men. I met the owners of the chop shop, and it turned out that all of them had been former political activists in a key opposition party, and were in jail, beginning because of their activism, ages 13 or 14, spent numerous years in jail. And after also, they all had decided that they did not want to join. They didn't know what to do. They didn't want to join the Palestinian police force, and they felt that this is one thing they can do, is until they figure out what they're going to do in the post-Oslo era, that they would, have this chop shop and steal cars, but it would be dedicated to this nationalist policy. And so that was kind of eye-opening in terms of, how people felt about, where they were in relation to Oslo. But what was also more interesting for me is I was in this village, this remote village, that looked like it could have been like Ramallah in the 70s. It didn't have fully running water or electricity. There was nothing in this village showed any of the promise of Oslo that you saw, like maybe in Ramallah or in other regions. So it really got me thinking about how this aid was being distributed, and how there was unequal access, and there was serious differences in terms of who had access to the post-Oslo promises. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating story, and it's really it's really telling. And who are the benefactors, or who are the benefactors of the Oslo process, and who came up on top, through that. And then that also in your book you talk about, we'll get to that in a little bit more, but who gets the aid money then as a result of that. The outcome, which was Oslo. So let's dive into it a little bit more. So what is significant about the nature of the political settlement after a protracted conflict, and what are its implications for successful democracy promotion efforts? And can you kind of explain why the political settlement in El Salvador worked and led to more democratic outcomes, and why this didn't happen in Palestine?
Okay, it's a very good question. And that's really that's elaborating on my argument. So what you have in the key difference in the political settlements in El Salvador and Palestinian territories is really the level of inclusivity of the settlement. In Palestine, you have this non-inclusive settlement that ends up, it's signed by Fatah, the leadership party of the PLO. And even when it's voted on in the PLO, it passes by one vote. At no point does the political settlement enjoy broad support also in Palestinian society. In the initial years after Oslo, I think there was people were kind of playing a wait and see approach, and they wanted to see what would eventually transpire. But even at the heyday, this is a political arrangement that did not enjoy a broad support, and key political actors are excluded from the onset. What I show in my research is what transpires in terms of, in Palestinian society, is you have the emergence of three different tendencies, each determined by their position vis-a-vis Oslo and whether or not they can access Western donor funding. So you have Fatah, and they can access in their clientelistic networks, they can access funding, they can, they also have access to funding of the PA and clientelistic networks. But where my contribution, I think, is where I differ with a lot of Palestinian scholars, is we can't talk about one opposition, because there certainly is not opposition. The opposition is fragmented. And what emerges is two tendencies that are both opposition leaning. One I refer to as liberal moderates. And they're the ones who say, okay, Oslo is here. We need to figure out how to navigate the post-Oslo era, and we're going to develop strategies. And they adopt a wait-and-see approach. Many of them are involved in professionalizing, their mass-based organizations. They're willing to take part in elections from the very beginning. Or later, not in the very beginning, but they also are willing to work in the PA, what have you. And then you have an opposition that is much more, not unwilling to engage with the Palestinian Authority, and also not, and they do not have access or have less access to foreign aid. And they're not in a position to promote what I refer to as a post-Cold War liberal order. And so aid here is playing this very polarizing, or has this very polarizing effect. by increasing the polarization between these different groups. In El Salvador, on the other hand, you have a very inclusive peace agreement that takes place in 1992. All major political groups are included in the negotiations of these agreements. And even the political parties that are not part of the negotiations, they're part of the inter-party commission. So they actually give feedback on the agreements and they endorse it. And so once there is a transition, a conflict to, more peace transition, all the major political groups are included. They all have same access to post-agreement political life and to engage in that, political arena in the same way. And they also more or less have the same access to foreign aid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, that's really interesting. Just looking at the political settlement and how that played out in both countries. So what programs were supported in El Salvador, and what programs were supported in Palestine after the peace agreements were signed?
And this is a very good question too. Things change over time, right? So if we're looking at different times, and if I look at things right now, they probably look different than the time period I'm examining. The time period I specifically examine is right after the Accords and for the 10 years after. And I'm interested in how it impacts civil society. And I have this comparison between the two cases, Palestine and El Salvador, but I have comparison within cases. And I'm looking at civil society, grassroots before the political agreements and after. But I could draw some key generalizations. In Palestine, foreign aid is a much larger operation. It's far more donors, especially state-sponsored donors, are involved. It's at least a third more than the aid that's given to El Salvador during this period. But in terms of per capita assistance, it's more than double, or close to double the assistance given to El Salvador. As I said, more state-sponsored donors are involved. The aid is more political. I mean, the key objective of this entire aid operation is to promote the Oslo Accords and to promote a peace agreement in this context. There's a lot of focus on infrastructure, budget support, later security, but really giving the appearance that Oslo has something to offer to the Palestinian people. And at the level of civil society, initially the focus is on NGOs that are led by key or important political figures, regardless of whether or not they have ties to grassroots or affiliated with mass-based organizations. And so often these individuals are promoted so that they can play some kind of role in Palestinian society in terms of promoting certain norms related to the peace process or to promoting what I refer to as the post-Cold War liberal order, market democracy as understood by the donors. In El Salvador, things look different. It's a smaller aid operation in general. And again, I'm talking about the post-Cold War era. Things look much different during the Cold War in El Salvador, but post-Cold War, after the political settlement, the aid is less political. There's much greater emphasis on economic development. There's also a lot or significant emphasis on local government. And in terms of the aid that's given to civil society organizations and to grassroots, a lot of the funding isn't coming necessarily from state-sponsored donors, but it's coming from smaller donors, from foundations. And an important criteria for these NGOs is that they need to have connections to the grassroots, be able to deliver services to the grassroots. So these are some of the key differences in terms of the aid that's given to both cases during this time period that I'm examining.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk kind of more about this professionalization of Palestinian civil society and NGOs? And you talk about that in your book, and you have a fairly long discussion on it, but you say that's not the reason why there's no democracy promotion efforts have
Or,
failed?
I mean, in the Palestinian case, many people explaining, many scholars explaining the weakening of civil society and this demobilization of civil society have argued that what really took place, or the key determining factor in ending up with this outcome, is this idea of NGO professionalization. Okay? So with the introduction of donor aid, NGOs are required to adopt a host of organizational changes that are required by the donors to make them basically better candidates for this aid. They need to professionalize their operations, for example. They need to have a clear pay scale. They need to be in a position to report, to the donors about the donor funding. They need to, basically meet the criteria of donors. So suddenly they're focusing. There's a lot of focus on these host of organizational changes that they must undergo, but also they're no longer simply accountable to their grassroots or their members, but they're also accountable to the donors who fund them. And so this is a very prevalent explanation in the Palestinian case, explaining kind of why civil society demobilized. Very importantly, it's an argument that does have merit. Many other scholars have advocated it in other contexts. In the 1990s, Sonia Alvarez and others made this argument in parts of Latin America about the weakening of the women's movement. Other scholars advanced this argument in the post-Soviet Russia about what happened maybe there to the weakening of grassroots organizations. That having been said, there is some merit to the argument. However, once you begin to compare the Palestinian case to other cases, the argument begins to lose some of its force. And this is when I examined the Salvadoran case. Yes, there was some demobilization, there was some weakening. Yes, organizations need to professionalize, but certainly there was something else happening in the Palestinian case. And so the more I investigated other cases where the grassroots did not demobilize to the same extent as the Palestinian case, I realized that I was more and more unconvinced by this argument.
Mm-hmm. So in kind of like a comparison to like how Palestinian civil society was before the Oslo Accords, what was kind of the, social setting for that? How did they operate? How were they structured? I guess where did their funding come from, if not from international development aid? Who did they serve? And how did Palestinian society perceive them, these civil society organizations?
Or mass-based. I mean, it's part of the broader like political developments that are taking place in the Palestinian territories during the 70s and 80s. But it was 1972 or 73, early 1970s. The PNC decided that they would shift the locus of attention of Palestinian struggle from the outside to the Palestinian territories. And the Palestinian territories would become the key site or the locus of Palestinian struggle. And they also decided that the masses would be incorporated into the struggle. So this is an early decision of the 1970s. And so all of the political organizations of the PLO and even later the Communist Party take part in these mass mobilization efforts. And each of the political organizations establishes mass-based organizations or committees but they're mass-based, involving all sectors of Palestinian society. So you have mass-based organizations for students, for women, for labor, for workers, professional syndicates, but Palestinian society is mobilized. And by the late 70s, early 80s, they've done this phenomenal job in terms of mobilizing Palestinian society. The objective of creating these mass-based organizations is that they, first of all, to empower the members of the organizations, and also to raise, and also to better fight against Israeli occupation and to better fight against Israeli colonial settlement. And so this was the mode of political organizing in the Palestinian territories. And it carries, this is what really carries the Palestinian Intifada. I mean, in the remotest villages, in the towns, women, workers, students are mobilized and they're organized and they're part of these committees to ask what was Palestine, the Palestine society, society's position is kind of misleading because they're part and parcel of society. I mean, they included, I mean, their tremendous strength was to recruit people from all walks of life from the remotest parts of the Palestinian territories. And so this was the mode of political organizing. In terms of funding, a lot of it, I mean, they relied on their own dues. They probably got some support from the parent political organizations, but they were predominantly volunteer-based, and there was probably some solidarity funding from abroad. But in terms of numbers, it's nothing comparable to what we're talking about, what happens post-Oslo in terms of the influx of aid.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer all the question, or was there another part I forgot?
No, that was, you hit all the points. One thing that kind of brings to mind is something that Palestinian sociologist Salim Tamari talks about this era. He talks about like a joyless culture of resistance, like during the first Intifada. And that was kind of, how people acted, I guess, through mass grassroots organizations. They couldn't be like, he kind of says like they couldn't be like publicly happy, and celebrating and things like that. But nowadays, after in the post-Oslo era, you find a lot of these civil society organizations, promoting, parties, face painting events for children, carnivals, just could you kind of talk about that?
I don't know if I agree. Okay, so I think in terms of nationalist resistance, yeah, certainly in the Intifada period, I mean, there's a seriousness. Was it joyless? I mean, I find Palestinian sense of humor pretty good, right? It's pretty good.
Yeah. So
on that one, I will. Yeah, so especially the jokes on checkpoints about Palestinian political leadership. I mean, it's amazing. So I'm reluctant to share the opinion. I do think right now it's a completely different mode of political organizing, and it's a different culture of political organizing. Is it more joyful? Maybe. I mean, there was this idea that, we're in a state building phase, we're in a different stage. But I do think that where we're at politically right now, in terms of, looming annexation, in terms of realizing the full extent of the failure of the Oslo Accords, in terms of, just in terms of the inability of Palestinian society to mobilize in the face of COVID, I think there's a realization of, things could, in terms of organizing, things could be in a different place. I imagine if we had this COVID crisis 25 years ago, the university students and the high school students would have mobilized campaigns throughout the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, educating the entire Palestinian population about COVID-19, about how, prevention, about how to, to support the community. And from and again, I'm far away and I'm not following this carefully, but from what I am following, I don't see this happening. Mm-hmm. So joyful, not joyful, there's a lot more happening. But, I think, I wouldn't underestimate Palestinian sense of humor.
Yes, definitely not. So are you
reading, are these questions from are these your questions or from viewers?
These are mine still.
Oh, still, okay. So.
Yeah. So coming full circle to how you first got interested in the subject, you said you went to this village that looked like, 1970s era Palestine, when you went to the chop shop to retrieve your car.
But no, just clarification. I actually didn't go to the chop shop. I went to an old woman's house in the village, and the chop shop owners came to meet me and to apologize.
Okay. But you kind of get to this village, and it's kind of been left behind. And so, can you kind of talk about how the distribution of international aid has created, you know, schisms like this, patchwork of aid going to some places and not to others, and what kind of effects has this had on?
And let me also just give back. I mean, this wasn't my only anecdotal observation to the unequal distribution of the post-Oslo benefits. As part of, in terms of the project I was working on, we also conducted a survey. Um, uh, it was a national survey about the extent to which Palestinians felt they had benefited from these post-Oslo developments, and if they were even familiar with all these new NGOs, or if they're benefiting in any way from all this influx of aid. And the overwhelming majority of Palestinians really had no idea, and it did not, and were clear in terms of not benefiting from the post-Oslo promise. It's not only about material assistance, but it's also about the promise of the post-Oslo period. And so the majority of Palestinians were not optimistic. In terms of the initial years of Oslo, I mean, there is this influx of assistance, and some of political cadre from key political organizations do a very good job about accessing this aid and establishing professionalized organizations. And, so there's them, there's Feteh and their clientelistic networks, and there's the many who feel they left out. And I don't like the categorization of, oh, the people who professionalized, sold out, because that's not true. I mean, some of these NGOs are involved in very, very impressive work. I mean, take for example, an organization like Women's Legal Aid and Counseling. And so the founders were key political organizers in the women's movement, but now they provide these important services of counseling in terms of, monitoring, laws pertaining to women's status, in terms of assisting women legally. So they do amazing work. However, they're not in the field organizing in terms of mobilizing. But once you talk to the activists, these schisms and the polarization is there. And it's really decreased the ability of Palestinians to organize, especially among the opposition. If it was only the PA and its opposition, they would have been able, I think, to organize. But the opposition is fragmented on many, along many cleavages.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, kind of?
Yeah, and it does. And I mean, it just, really, after what you just said, and really just reading your whole book, you kind of just ask, yourself as a reader, what does U.S. aid or international aid really hope to accomplish? Is it really, their stated goals of democracy promotion, or, yeah, I guess.
I spoke, and very importantly, I focus a bit more maybe on U.S. United States assistance from the United States in my work, but I'm looking at. I looked systematically at 7 state-sponsored donors, and who were operating in Palestine and El Salvador, and I carefully examined their programs. And in the Palestinian case, I think, in all the cases, I met with key people in those donor offices or in the donor agency. And they will tell you explicitly that they are there to promote the peace accords and to promote, the peace process. So their intentions are very political, and they're optimistic about democracy. I mean, they were to an extent, but by 2006 and after Hamas wins the elections, it's very clear the kind of what democracy means in this context. But it's important, I mean, even the early periods, I mean, the bigger donor than the United States was the European Union. And to them, it's very clear that promoting peace in this area is important to us. This is our backyard. And if there's stability in this area, there'll be stability for us. So their intentions are clear, they're political, they're self-interested. It's of geostrategic significance to them.
And do you, I guess, would you see this as kind of as problematic, I guess, for
I think people weren't, you know, fully appreciating the problems associated with a political settlement that enjoys minimal support and where key political actors are not included. And it's not clear what would happen. I mean, they run in the 2006 elections, but they run and they're allowed to run because everybody was bargaining that they would lose. And the United States gave permission and encouraged to allow Hamas to run with the assumption that Hamas will lose. And right now, right now, okay, all pretense is gone. But up until like 2009, 2010, I mean, laws have been passed on the Palestinian side that any group or anyone who runs in the elections has to endorse all previous political agreements. So this is the kind of democracy that the Palestinians have, is where they need to endorse and support a political settlement in place. If you do not endorse this political settlement, you cannot be part of the formal political process, formal democratic political process.
Yeah, and I mean, with the Oslo Accords, there really wasn't, I mean, there was an agreement, but there really wasn't an agreement. They left those, final status issues to be dealt with later, and, things such as, where are the boundaries, water issues, Jerusalem, and other very important issues for state building. So I guess my question is, I guess having a settlement that's really not a settlement, political settlement, is and still having the occupation, Israeli occupation over Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Can there really be real democracy promotion and really, and could the Oslo Accords even succeed, even with a huge influx of donor aid, US aid going to support this peace process?
And no, your point is a very valid one, but I do take issue with one part of what you said. Many will argue that, well, democracy will not take place in the Palestinian territories because there is Israeli occupation, and now they add there's the travel restrictions. And my response, my rejoinder to that is it's not, I'm not convinced, because Palestinians were able to organize amazingly. I mean, if you think of Palestinian organizing strategies in the 70s and 80s, it's a role model for, for much of the world in terms of grassroots organizing. El Salvador actually does that too with their mass-based organizations. But they were able to organize despite tremendous challenges. And if they were able to do it then, I think they can do it now. There are other challenges right now. But because when we talk about democracy, I think it's important, it's not only about elections at the national level, but it's also about elections on the local level. It's about elections in the syndicates, and it's elections in the unions. It's really about developing this democratic culture at different levels. And for everything we can criticize about in the past, about democratic centralism, about the political parties having too much say, people believed that they had input. And there was elections taking place in these different bodies. You do not have any of that right now, as far as what I am able to see from the outside.
Yeah. So let me come to a audience question here. I know you touched on some of it, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. So the question is, are there specific US-based groups who have influence for what kind of aid is sent to Palestine, and who in Palestine receives the assistance? If so, do they have an agenda they hope to achieve through the assistance?
Oh, certainly. And this has become more the case. I mean, the aid has to be approved. It's congressionally approved. And the criteria have been from 2003, where NGOs had to sign all sorts of, every employee in the NGO had to sign anti-terrorism, criteria, to more recently. And just where we're at right now, all aid to the Palestinians, all civilian and humanitarian aid has been suspended or eliminated by the Trump administration because the Palestinian leadership will not accept the deal of the century. So definitely, it is very political, and interest groups are playing a role in determining the priorities of this aid, and what the criteria should be for dispersing it or providing it in the first place, even.
Mm-hmm. And I guess actually a more broader question about U.S. aid. Are we talking when we're talking about U.S. aid, are we talking about the organization U.S. aid, the United States Agency for International Development, or by itself solely, or are we also talking about other organizations and its partners?
What I look at, and it's a very good question, what I am looking at in my book, because I'm looking at civil society and democracy promotion. So I do talk, I give an overview of all assistance, and some of it is coming from different pockets, but the bulk of my analysis in the book is USAID. By the time I discuss, so the first part of the book is discussing those 10 years after Oslo, right? And the changes that have taken place. And then I expand the time period, but basically the geographic and time period, the aperture of the study. And I talk about what happens after Hamas's election in 2006. And there I'm looking at other mechanisms of aid to the Palestinians. And by 2003 onward, you have an influx of much more security assistance to the Palestinians. This is not being dispersed through USAID. This is being dispersed through definitely other mechanisms. So yeah, that's a very important question.
Yeah. So I know it's goes up and down depending on the political situation, but approximately how much USA goes to Palestine? Yeah.
Oh, US, I don't have that number on me right now. But what I do have, but just historically, the United States was one of the largest donors to the Palestinian territories. And usually in the period I examined, the 10 years, their funding is competing with the European Union in terms of amounts of funding given to the Palestinians. The numbers for those 10 years are in the book, so I urge everyone to look at. I don't have them. I don't have them memorized off the top of my head. But in terms of total assistance to the Palestinians since 1994, it's approximately $35 billion, give or take. And that's all donors, not simply the United States.
Wow. So 1994 to the present day.
Yes.
Okay.
Give or take. I don't know if, and I have to, determining these numbers seems a lot easier than it actually is. I don't know if that includes Qatar, I don't know who, but that's kind of a ballpark figure that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if we can get another audience question here. Let's see. All right, so this viewer asks, are there any countries in the Middle East where you believe US aid is lacking, but could go a long way toward facilitating positive outcomes?
And that's also a good question, but I don't want to give a definite answer about, yeah, definitely. I think it's very important to disaggregate the aid and and not to make generalizations, because there's very important nuances. But even in the Palestinian case, it's important to keep in mind that USAID was a key donor to UNRWA. And that's aid that was, badly needed. US aid was also a key donor to many of the Palestinian hospitals, like in Maqasid, I believe, a number of the Palestinian hospitals. So that's an area where this aid is needed. And I feel, yeah, we can talk about dependency and, these, maybe they should be more independent, but until there's an alternative, I don't think anyone should be calling for the discontinuation of this aid. In other Arab countries, I think in a context where I want to say maybe Tunisia, because that seems to me as the most inclusive political case right now, okay, with all its problems. But honestly, it's something I'd have to study in a bit more detail. But where US aid has been also disastrous has been in Iraq. And that's what I talk about in the last chapter of the book. I talk about aid to Iraq versus South Africa, and how in Iraq, given how non-inclusive the settlement is after the overthrow of Saddam, aid is simply exacerbating polarization, and US aid is definitely making everything worse in that context. But nuance is important. That's what I'm trying to get at. So.
Let's see. I have another question here, and let's see if anyone else asks another question in the meantime. So you conducted a lot of interviews for this research, and was it easy to find people to interview? And were there any obstacles? And what was the most interesting interview that you conducted?
Wow. Okay. I mean, going to do fieldwork is a lot of preparation, and it could be quite stressful. And but once you're in the field and it begins, you begin the process. It's very enjoyable. And what I was surprised, I have to say, was just the willingness of people to meet, and their how frank they were in their interviews, and the extent to which they really tried to help. And I still remember that very fondly. Of course, there were some people who didn't want to meet. There were some people who didn't give the best interviews, but definitely all of that. I mean, those incidents, and they happen naturally. It was overshadowed by, my positive experience and just all the support one gets in the field. And that happened in Palestine and in El Salvador also. In terms of my most, you said memorable or interesting?
Yeah, either one.
I think I had a lot of interesting interviews, but my most memorable was, I think, Marwan Barghouti. And this one was kind of an accidental interview. But I was meeting with someone, and they said, and we talked about, just the history of grassroots organizing, and we're talking, I mean, my focus in the book is on the women's sector, but we were discussing different sectors. And that person said, you really need to look more at students. And Marwan was president of Birzeit student body, and he was a key figure in establishing Shabiba, Fatih's youth wing. And so maybe you should talk to him. And I said, I really, I'm sure he's too busy. Like, he was just elected to Fatih's Revolutionary Council. He was a member of the Legislative Council, and everything else he was doing. And he was wanted by Israel at that period. He's on, no, just call his office and I'll put in a word for you. And I, just did it later that day. I called, and so I called, and they said, okay, whatever, we'll get back to you. And then he, the next day, the person I had met with the day before said, look, I could put in a phone call for you. You're going to get a phone call from his security, and they're going to ask you where you're at. So don't get scared. So then I was like, okay, great. Now I'm being tracked by security. Like, this is all I really could have done without this interview. So like, as he said, they called me later in the day and they wanted to know my whereabouts. I guess I must have been monitored. And so I told them, and that was it for that day. And then they called again and they would ask where I'm at. And I'm like, okay, really, did I need this interview? But then they call me like another day and they're like, where are you right now? And I told them, and they said, okay, you have an interview in about 45 minutes. This is where you'll come to his meeting plate, where he's holding meetings. And so I wasn't fully prepared for the meeting. And I started, I had some questions on me. I added some, and I went to that meeting, and it ended up, he insisted I had to have Nescafe. So it was like my fourth coffee for the day, and I'm shaking from all the caffeine. And there's security everywhere. But it was a very interesting, interview about, his organizing, establishing Shabiba and his days at Birzeit University. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Do you talk about that story in the book, or
no? Actually, that's not. I mean, there's a my research. It's important. There's 5 research trips involved in my work. So one of my first research trips is 2001, and that's the interview that takes place then. And then I had several other research trips after. So no, there's quotes from him because I think we forget. He's now has 5 life sentences. He's in jail for 5 life sentences, and we forget this role he's played in grassroots organizing. And so there's that, but this story isn't in the book, no.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if we have any other audience questions. So let's see. Someone asked kind of a lot of the stuff you've already gone over, but I guess one part of the question, though, that you could probably talk a little bit more about is they're asking if you could if you can concisely state the objectives for you writing the book. Like what was like when in your preliminary thinking of doing this book.
My preliminary is okay. You read a lot of once you're immersed in this, the research, you're reading a lot of the critical literature. And my work, I am critical, but what I really wanted to get at is the nuances, the different nuances, why in some contexts, some democracy promotion efforts are more successful as others. So this is this broad question, but also the way I approached it is I feel as an academic, it's so easy to be critical. And we do that, and especially I think I have a lot of personal tension as being Palestinian and being an academic abroad. And it's so reason to sit abroad and say, the grassroots should do that, and they should be doing that, and they should be doing that, and this should be done, and to, give policy prescriptions. And so what I wanted to do is to write a critical assessment and to explain what's happening, but also I wanted to be slightly positive and show that things can be done differently, possibly, and that we shouldn't, succumb to explanations like professionalization, where everything is out of our hands. We have agency.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Taking this nuanced approach, because you can't just say it's black and white. I think there's, a lot of things to look at, and you have to kind of weigh, what's their contribution to the outcomes. And yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Let's see if we can get a couple more here before we wrap it up. So someone is asking, kind of like, why promote democracy in Palestine and the Middle East if leaders think that the USA and Israel will accept a secular democracy in both Israel and Palestine under one constitution. It's a little bit unclear, but I think what they're kind of saying is that maybe it's kind of like, perhaps they're talking about a one-state solution. I'm not sure about the one constitution part here.
But what about the one constitution?
I think, okay, I'm trying to decipher it a little bit, but so perhaps a better way of putting this is, do you think the USA and Israel will accept secular democracy in both Israel and Palestine under one constitution? I think that's a better way of putting it.
Of course, they're not going to accept, but political realities impose themselves on states. But yeah, of course, they're not going to fund, USAID is not going to create a program to promote a one state solution.
Yeah.
But that answer?
Yeah. Here's one more from another audience viewer. How did the Israeli imprisonment of elected Hamas officials after the 2006 elections affect public opinion towards democracy and its prospects for Palestinians?
Oh yeah, no, after 2006, there was just a huge question mark on what does democracy even mean. After the 1996 elections, and remember, key groups didn't run, most people didn't run. So, Hamas, Fatah was running against itself. There was, so there are a lot of question marks about what democracy would look like. And certainly after 2006 and the outcomes of 2006, there were a lot of, people are very skeptical of whether democracy can take place in this context. But very importantly, I mean, the imprisonment of, MPs, members of parliament, doesn't only take place after 2006. Many were arrested even prior. So that was an ongoing issue. So I think, and again, these are people I really respect politically. Their position was, okay, we know there's limitations here, but we need to have some kind of, democratic exercise, even if it's limited. But for the public, they definitely became more skeptical after 2006. But many would still argue that that probably is the only way to go, is to have national elections, even if they are imperfect. But we kind of need to get out of this political paralysis, and this is one way to go about it. And you could agree or disagree. I disagree, but certainly people I really respect politically do make these arguments.
Mm-hmm. So for a final question here, to wrap it up, what book and research projects do you have next lined up for the future?
I was supposed to be in the field right now, but it's okay. It's okay if things are delayed. I'm working on a book that examines how economic crises and resultant inequality leads to different patterns of mass mobilization. The book will also be will be through a cross-regional lens. I'll be looking at Latin American cases and Middle Eastern cases. I'm comparing Middle Eastern cases after the Arab uprisings and the Latin American cases in the 1980s, and also what happened last year and the year before. And like promoting democracy, I really want to try to bring in the underrepresented voices. So that is the next book project. And I'm looking forward to being in the field and making it happen.
Yeah, I hope, this coronavirus situation can clear in the, near to midterm.
Well, not only for my book, for humanity, for humanity. For all of us. Okay. The book could be delayed a bit. It's okay, but for humanity, yes. Certainly.
Yeah. I wish you the best of luck in that, and we look forward to your next book and having it in our bookstore whenever that time may be.
Again, no, thank you, and again, thank you for organizing this, Sammy. And I was delighted when I came by. Are you open now? By the way, is the bookstore open?
We're open for appointments, and our online store is up and running, so we can deliver anything that people order.
But when I walked by the store and I saw my book there, it was very nice. So thank you again for organizing this and for having me here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to thank all of our viewers too for joining us today for this book talk hosted by the Washington Report and Middle East Books and More. If you'd like to support our store as well as Manal, you can buy her book at the link below this video. And you can also like and share our video today too with your friends and colleagues. So again, thank you. And we look forward to having more book talks for everyone in the future here.
Thank you again. Okay, good day. Bye.
Yeah, bye.